right, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's an honor for me to be here. I imagine none of you expected to spend your Valentine's Day listening to me. But I'm glad you did, and I'm honored to have you here, and it's great to look out over your very friendly faces and to see you. So thank you so much and for inviting me to be here. Just a quick question, because I'm in Emitt Till country, but I also come across those who don't know much about the case. And before I get into what I want to talk about, can I just get a show of hands of those of you who are familiar with the basic story of Emitt Till? It's like most of you are. I'm seeing almost all the hands up. So, all right, and I'll talk a little bit about the story itself as I talk about what I'm going to talk about. And it's kind of a first for me to focus specifically on really the journey of writing this book. I've talked a lot about the end results. I've talked about the book itself and the story, the Emitt Till story, and how I've portrayed it in the book. But the journey of writing the book is also a story in itself, which I've come to think about quite a bit. And I touch on it here and there, but it's a bit of a challenge for me to do it because there's so much I could say about the journey. I'd like to take you back, well, to take myself back here to, because most of you probably weren't born, a lot of you weren't, but the fall of 1994, when I was a student at the University of Utah. I just moved there and to major in history, and I knew something about African American history from my studies, and so I decided to check out of the library the video series Eyes on the Prize, which is a history of the civil rights movement. And the very first episode of that, there's a 15-minute segment focused on the Emitt Till case, and that's where I got my introduction. And for 15 minutes I sat and I watched, and I learned about this 14-year-old boy from Chicago that had come down to Mississippi to spend a couple weeks with his family there, his great uncle, along with some other cousins around his same age. And him being from the north, he didn't understand the way things were in the south then, and he whistled at this white woman, and he didn't think much of it, but those around him did. And what that caused was, for 3 days later, he was kidnapped by the woman's husband and his brother and brutally murdered. And I learned about this. I sat there watching about this case. A million things were going through my head. One of them was, why didn't I already know about this? Especially since they positioned it as the case that really pushed the civil rights movement forward. Why didn't I know? And as I was thinking about that, I learned that these men who killed him went to trial and were acquitted within just a little over an hour, and were set free. And they sold their story to a reporter because they couldn't be tried again. Sold that story for over $3,000 and proudly talked about everything they had done to Emitt Till in murdering him, and were paid for this. So they basically profited off this crime, and that angered me. And the fact that there was this horrible injustice, all this just was eating at me, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And so that began a 20-year journey, well, 24 years now, this fall, of me and Emitt Till. The one thing, if I could leave with you right off the bat, like with me in this case, once I learned about this, it wouldn't leave my mind. And I spent about 10 years thinking about it. And during that 10 years, I came to know Emitt Till's mother. And I came to know her because about 2 years after I discovered the case, I decided to take a class at the university on American racism. And for my final project, I decided I would interview her about the case and turn in the transcript of my interview with some, just introductory material by me, and that would be my project. And so I was able to find her, and I found her phone number, and I called her. And that began a 6-year friendship between maybe Till Mobley and myself, until she died in early 2003. And if there's anything I can leave with you, is if something ever grabs you and begins to consume you like that, don't ignore it, because you're kind of meant to do something with it. And at the time, I didn't dream I would write a book about the Emmett Till case. I just knew I couldn't get it out of my mind. But things started happening over the course of the next few years. For the next 10 years, as I said, I got to know Emmett Till's mother, and then the case went from just a bit of history, American history to me, to something very personal. Because once I came to know her, I couldn't divorce myself from that personal aspect of it. I was a historian, or a budding historian at the time, at one level, where you kind of need to be objective and keep your distance, but at the same time I came to know her, and then suddenly I felt like I was a part of history, that this wasn't just a case to be read about. I knew the main protagonist that was still alive. And so that changed everything. And then that, step by step after that, 10 years of just reading everything I could, interviewing her many times, and then the fall of 2004, I began writing this book. So I had 10 years of just consuming everything I could find. And in the process, I discovered that I had a lot of questions. And in having these questions, I wasn't getting any answers. And I realized the only way I'm going to get the answers is if I dig deep and try to find them myself and tell this story in a fully comprehensive way. No book on the case had ever really attempted to write the entire story in all of its detail, and the detail in this case is so fascinating, it's stranger than fiction in a lot of ways. And so, starting in 2004 until 2014, I made several trips down here, at least a dozen, to Mississippi and to Chicago, interviewed more people, family members of Emmett Till, not jurors, they were all dead by then, but reporters who covered the trial for various newspapers, and other witnesses who were at the store when Emmett Till whistled at Carolyn Bryant, who were at the house when Emmett was kidnapped, and people who heard him being murdered. I interviewed all these people. Many of them have since died too, and so glad I started the book when I did, because those voices are now gone and I needed to talk to them. And so that the way the case was consuming me went from just me gathering information and storing it in my brain to then actively researching and writing for another 10 years. And the thing that really prompted that for me was that in the spring of 2004, the Justice Department reopened the case and began an investigation. The FBI began investigating it. During 2004 and 2005, they investigated the case. And the reason they did so is because some documentaries that had been done and had really pushed the idea that there were other people involved in Emmett Till's murder besides those two men who were tried. And that was well known at the time of the trial too, because surprise witnesses came forward during the trial and said, yes, we saw other men there at the barn where Emmett was killed. There were some other white men. And there were some black men that were on the back of the truck who were restraining Emmett Till, which you can assume in this case these were field hands that were forced into helping. They weren't willing participants, but nevertheless they were witnesses and they had some level of involvement. And so when I started writing the book, I thought, this is good timing, because the case, it's an important piece of our past, but yet it's also becoming part of our present, once again, because the case has been opened. So as I began working on the book, yes, it was a 50-year-old case, but I didn't know how the final chapters were going to come out, because they had yet to be written in history because of this investigation. So for 2004 and 2005, the FBI investigated this case, turned their findings over to the state of Mississippi, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too, because a lot of information came out as a result of that FBI investigation. So one of the first things I discovered is that there are a lot of myths associated with this case. Now, when you hear people talk about the past, if they were involved with it, memory itself isn't all that reliable much of the time. There are times, I keep a journal regularly, and there are times I write, as things happen, and sometimes I go back and I'm remembering events in my mind, and the way I tell them later on, if I go back in my journal, I realize this isn't the person that was with me that day. I thought it was so-and-so and it was somebody else, and this isn't where it happened. And the things you forget, you'd be surprised.